Imagine a night when one decision changes everything, a routine stop that unearths deep-seated assumptions and forces one officer to confront her inner demons. In a world where authority can be both a shield and a weapon, what happens when the power dynamic flips in the blink of an eye? Stay tuned as we reveal a story of regret, realization, and the ultimate choice between denial and growth. Officer Amber Ford believed that every shift was an opportunity to reinforce the law and her own control. Working in the sprawling urban landscape of Riverbend, a city where the night often cloaks both beauty and danger, she took pride in her ability to keep order, regardless of the hour. On an otherwise quiet evening, just after 10 p.m., Amber parked her patrol car near a desolate lot on the outskirts of a usually unremarkable intersection. The quiet hum of streetlights and the sparse movement of vehicles were the only companions in that lonely night. Her attention was suddenly drawn to a sleek, black sedan gliding through the intersection. Its design was unmistakably upscale, the sort of vehicle that seemed to belong in the driveway of a corporate magnate. Everything about the car was ordinary until Amber noticed one glaring omission: the absence of a turn signal. To her, even the smallest violation warranted a reminder of the law's unyielding nature. Convinced that rules were made to be enforced without compromise, she accelerated her cruiser ever so slightly to close the distance. A quick flash of her lights sent a clear message, and the sedan's brake lights flared as the driver eased into a safe pull-over. Amber exited her vehicle deliberately, one hand resting on her belt and the other adjusting her radio. The night remained hushed, punctuated only by the soft murmur of the streetlights overhead and the occasional distant car. As she neared the driver's side window, the glass descended slowly as though orchestrating the arrival of fate. Behind the window, she found him, a black man in his mid-40s, his beard impeccably groomed and his tailored navy suit exuding an air of refined confidence. His hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, and his eyes met hers without a trace of fear or defiance. Rather, they seemed to convey a silent challenge. Amber's stomach churned unexpectedly. There was something unsettling about the calm assurance in his gaze, a look that suggested he had nothing to fear. "License and registration," she ordered, her tone firm and authoritative. The man blinked once before reaching for his glove compartment, his movement deliberate, as if he anticipated her every thought. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" he asked smoothly, his voice unruffled. Amber crossed her arms and, with barely a pause, repeated, "License and registration." The man handed them over with a measured calmness, not once betraying a hint of nervousness. His manner exuded quiet confidence, which only seemed to irritate her further. When she glanced briefly at his identification, his aura of composed defiance made her blood simmer. "Do you live around here?" she demanded. He exhaled a slow, deliberate breath that carried the weight of an unspoken message. "I don't see how that's relevant," he replied evenly. Amber's grip tightened as she scrutinized the ID. In her 15 years on the force, she had learned to trust her instincts, yet something about his calm demeanor challenged her authority. Without further ado, she ordered him out of the vehicle. His expression shifted imperceptibly as he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, his stature surprisingly imposing. Though his movements betrayed no overt hostility, there was a quiet power in his presence that set her heart racing. Standing tall and broad-shouldered, he exuded a calm energy that contrasted sharply with the tension Amber was trying to enforce. Gesturing toward the trunk, she indicated that he should follow. The man exhaled once more, a slow, deliberate motion before placing his palms on the cool metal of the trunk. In that charged moment, the balance of power shifted, and Amber, feeling a mixture of entitlement and frustration, reached out and pressed her hand against his back to guide him slightly. He stiffened, and that was the instant everything changed. In a flash of uncontrolled anger, her hand struck his cheek. The sound a sharp, stinging crack reverberated in the quiet street as his head jerked to the side, his body momentarily frozen. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. Amber's own breath hitched, and the weight of her action sank in. Slowly, the man turned his head back toward her, his expression morphing into something unreadable, his jaw clenching imperceptibly. In one fluid, deliberate movement, he reached into his jacket pocket. Amber's stomach lurched as he withdrew his identification. With an unhurried calm, he held up the card, revealing his name, Malcolm Reed. Scanning the ID, her eyes widened in disbelief. He was not just any driver, but the chief of police. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The realization that she had struck her superior overwhelmed her. Her hands went numb as if the ground beneath her had crumbled away. There stood Chief Reed, calmly displaying his identification with a demeanor that was neither angry nor demanding. His quiet gaze was a stark contrast to the charged emotions that roiled within her. Amber's mind raced. How could this have happened? There was no immediate fury in his eyes, no demand for an apology, only a deep, silent disappointment that pierced her like 1,000 unspoken words. Before she could muster an explanation, the sound of another patrol car approaching shattered the silence. The flashing blue and red lights split the darkness into fractured colors. Officer Carter, her longtime partner, stepped out of the vehicle, his face etched with confusion and concern. Amber attempted to speak, but Chief Reed interjected smoothly, "Fine." He slipped his ID back into his pocket without looking at Carter, his gaze locked on Amber. Officer Carter's eyes shifted between the two of them as he asked, "Am I free to go?" The question hung in the air. For a moment, Amber hesitated, her hands twitching as she sought to regain control of the situation. It was that moment, one in which she desperately wanted to restore order, that she faltered. A low, controlled chuckle emanated from Chief Reed. "Officer Ford," he said, tilting his head slightly, "are you detaining me?" His tone was neither accusatory nor mocking, yet the underlying gravity of the moment was unmistakable. Under the heavy scrutiny of Carter's gaze, Amber stammered incoherently. In that pause, the atmosphere grew even heavier. Chief Reed's measured chuckle was not one of amusement but rather a somber reminder of the consequences of unchecked authority. With a calm tilt of his head, he inquired once more, "Are you detaining me, Officer Ford?" His question cut through her defenses like a knife, leaving her scrambling for words that would justify her actions. As the tension built, Carter's eyes widened in disbelief. "What did he say to you?" he asked, his voice trembling with both confusion and concern. Amber's jaw clenched as she attempted to recall the events, but the memory was clouded by a mix of anger and regret. "Nothing," she finally managed, though the words rang hollow in the charged silence. Officer Carter exchanged a long, troubled look with her, shaking his head in silent dismay. "It was just a stop," he murmured, though his tone suggested he doubted that interpretation. In the wake of this surreal encounter, Chief Reed simply turned and walked back to his patrol car. Without a word, he slid into the driver's seat and let the sleek black sedan disappear into the night. For a brief moment, Amber felt both relief and dread: relief that the confrontation had not escalated further, and dread at the unknown repercussions of her impulsive act. Once the sedan had vanished, Officer Carter turned his concerned gaze on her. "Amber, what the hell was that?" he demanded. Her mouth closed tight, as if trying to keep the storm of emotions locked inside. "It was just a stop," she repeated, her voice sounding weaker with every syllable. Carter's frown deepened as he studied her expression, which seemed haunted by an invisible specter. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he remarked, unable to mask his worry. Before Amber could offer any further explanation, a sinking feeling took root in her gut. Chief Reed had chosen not to escalate the situation publicly. Instead, he allowed the matter to fizzle out, leaving her to grapple with the internal chaos of guilt and shame. That night, as she lay in her bed, sleep eluded her. Every moment replayed in her mind the way Reed had looked at her, the chilling silence after the strike, and the weight of the decision that had irrevocably altered the course of her career. Instead of the expected anger or relief that she might have felt, an oppressive sense of shame washed over her. In that endless silence, the truth was inescapable: she had crossed a line that she could never uncross. The following morning, Amber awoke with her stomach in knots. Each movement was accompanied by a physical reminder of her mistake. Her uniform felt like a shackle as she dressed, her trembling hands betraying her inner turmoil. As she buttoned her jacket, she wondered if this misstep would soon be the subject of an internal affairs report. Moments later, a single message flashed on her phone: a terse order from the Department's Internal Affairs Office: report to the Chief's office immediately. Her breath caught in her throat. With a heavy heart and a mind swirling with regret, she drove to the precinct. Every step inside the building felt surreal. The usual hustle and bustle of officers going about their day was now punctuated by furtive glances and hushed whispers. Even the receptionist's indifferent nod as she passed by added to the suffocating pressure. Every corner of the station seemed to whisper that word: consequences. Amber's anxiety grew as she took the elevator, each floor ascending like a countdown to an inevitable reckoning. The corridor leading to Chief Reed's office felt unnervingly long as she forced herself to breathe steadily. When she finally reached the door and stepped inside, Reed was already seated at his desk, absorbed in a thick file. Sitting silently beside him was Captain Bryant, a man whose stoic demeanor belied decades of service. His arms were crossed, and his face was an unreadable mask that seemed to judge every heartbeat of the unfolding drama. After a long, agonizing pause, Chief Reed finally looked up. "Officer Ford," he said evenly, gesturing for her to take a seat. The moment she sat, the gravity of her actions pressed down on her like an anchor. Reed leaned back, clasping his hands together as if preparing to impart a difficult truth. His voice remained calm, yet every word carried the weight of an unspoken indictment. "Tell me," he began slowly, "how would you report last night's stop?" Amber's throat went dry. She recounted the incident with painstaking detail: a simple traffic violation that had spiraled into something unthinkable. "It was a routine stop for failing to signal," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Reed's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, as if searching her soul for any hint of dishonesty. "And then?" he pressed softly. With a heavy heart, Amber admitted, "I struck the driver after asking him to exit the vehicle." The words were like shards of glass, each syllable piercing the quiet tension of the room. Reed's gaze hardened, and his voice took on a tone that was both disappointed and measured. "Did you feel threatened?" he inquired calmly. "Did you resist?" His questions were not interrogations, they were an invitation for her to confront the truth of her actions. "No, sir," she whispered, each denial sounding more inadequate than the last. "I merely lost my temper." For a long, excruciating moment, silence reigned. Then Reed slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. "Suspension notice," he stated flatly. "You are placed on indefinite administrative leave pending further review." The words hit her like a sledgehammer. Never before in her 15 years of service had she experienced such a fall from grace. As her trembling fingers reached for the notice, the reality of her suspension, a suspension of 60 days without pay, combined with mandatory de-escalation and bias training, settled over her like a dark cloud. Amber's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall as she struggled to find words to justify her actions. Reed's gaze, however, remained impassive. "Chief Reed," she started weakly, but before she could continue, he rose from his seat and dismissed her with a simple, final statement, "We're not done." With that, she left the office, feeling as if the weight of the world had been pressed onto her shoulders. Outside the precinct, in the solitude of her patrol car, Amber's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her mind churned with regret and uncertainty. How could she have let her emotions override her training? The looming specter of the internal affairs investigation left her no choice but to confront the hard truth. Her actions were not only unprofessional, they were a manifestation of a bias she had long denied. In the following days, silence enveloped her. The station's corridors, once filled with the mundane sounds of everyday duty, now echoed with whispers and sideways glances. Her phone remained stubbornly silent, and the absence of any direct confrontation from her colleagues provided no solace, only an ever-deepening isolation. For 3 long days, she remained trapped in a personal purgatory, tormented by the recurring images of that fateful night. Then, on the 4th day, the call she had been dreading finally came through. Internal Affairs had summoned her back to the precinct. With clammy hands and a heavy heart, Amber drove to the station, the brightness of the day doing nothing to warm the chill in her gut. As she stepped into the building, every officer's gaze seemed to follow her, a silent reminder of the incident that had upended her life. In the conference room, seated around a long table, were Captain Bryant, Investigator Davis, and Chief Reed. The air was thick with tension as the trio awaited her arrival. Investigator Davis opened the meeting with a measured tone. "Officer Ford, let us discuss last week's stop." His voice was calm, but the weight of the moment was unmistakable. Amber recounted the events once more, detailing every action from the initial traffic stop to the moment she had lost control and struck the driver. As she spoke, she could see the silent exchanges between the others, each glance a judgment, each pause a silent reprimand. When she reached the point where she described the escalation, Investigator Davis's eyes widened slightly, and Captain Bryant shifted in his seat. "According to your statement," Davis continued, "you mentioned that you felt the driver was uncooperative. Is that correct?" Amber's throat tightened as she admitted, "Yes, sir." But as she spoke, her mind raced back to that single word, uncooperative, a word that seemed to encapsulate everything she had been trying to avoid facing. The room fell silent as Davis continued flipping through his notes. "At what moment did you escalate from verbal communication to physical force?" he asked, his tone both curious and stern. Amber's heart pounded painfully in her chest as she struggled to articulate the turning point. I struck him after asking him to exit the vehicle," she finally confessed, her voice trembling with regret. In that moment, the silence in the room was so profound that it felt as if the walls themselves were closing in. Chief Reed's eyes met hers, and in that gaze, Amber recognized not only disappointment but also an invitation to reflect. "Tell me," he said quietly, "what made you strike him?" His voice was gentle yet unyielding, demanding that she confront the truth behind her actions. For the first time that day, she could no longer hide behind excuses. "I lost my temper," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "because I assumed he was resisting my authority." The confession hung heavily in the air, laden with an unspoken acknowledgement of the bias that had guided her actions. Davis cleared his throat as the gravity of her confession sank in. "Officer Ford, you have been a model officer for 15 years, with no prior disciplinary actions. That does work in your favor," he noted, though his tone left little room for optimism. However, this incident constitutes an unjustified use of force. We are looking at a minimum suspension of 60 days without pay, in addition to mandatory de-escalation and bias training. A second offense of this nature will result in termination. Amber's heart sank further with each word, the weight of her actions becoming increasingly unbearable. Silence reigned for several long minutes before Chief Reed spoke again. "Officer Ford," he said evenly, "we are not here to tear you apart. We are here to help you understand the gravity of what has happened and to give you a choice to truly reflect on your actions and decide if you are willing to change." His words, measured yet heavy with implication, resonated deep within her. She could feel the truth of them in every fiber of her being, even as the bitter taste of regret filled her mouth. Unable to form a coherent response, Amber's mind went blank. Finally, Chief Reed slid a single piece of paper across the table. "This is your suspension notice," he stated calmly. "Effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave until further review. Consider this a chance to sit with your actions and truly understand the bias that led you here." The simple document seemed to encapsulate the full measure of her mistake, a mistake that would not be erased by a simple apology or a quick fix. After the meeting, as Amber walked out of the conference room, the weight of those words settled over her like an unyielding shroud. Every step she took was heavy with the knowledge that her career, her integrity, and her self-image had been irrevocably altered. The silence of the precinct, the quiet judgment of her colleagues, and the disapproving glances that followed her every move only deepened the chasm of regret within her. For days after the suspension, Amber found herself trapped in a cycle of isolation and introspection. Even the normally mundane tasks of daily life were marred by the constant reminder of that single, fateful moment. She barely slept, her mind a ceaseless echo of her mistaken echo that grew louder with each passing hour. The absence of any overt repercussions from the public or her fellow officers provided little solace. Instead, it left her alone with the burden of her guilt and the realization that she had betrayed the very principles she had sworn to uphold. Then, on the fourth day, her phone buzzed with a message from Chief Reed. The message was brief and unadorned: "Meet me at Lakeside Park in 10 minutes." The simplicity of the directive belied the storm of emotions it would soon unleash. With a heart full of trepidation and a mind that was both numb and anxious, Amber quickly donned her jacket and left the safety of her home. The cool night air did little to calm her racing thoughts as she made her way to Lakeside Park, a secluded area known for its quiet paths and reflective ambience. Upon arrival, she found the park nearly deserted. A few joggers paced along the winding trails, a couple shared a quiet conversation on a bench, and the soft glow of streetlights cast long, wavering shadows across the pavement. In the distance, by a gently flowing river under an old bridge, stood Chief Reed. His posture was relaxed, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his jacket. He remained silent, his eyes fixed on the water as if seeking answers in its endless current. Amber's steps faltered as she approached him. "You called me," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of apprehension and unspoken questions. Reed slowly nodded without turning, as if weighing her presence. Finally, he spoke, his tone measured and calm. "Do you know why I didn't report you myself?" he asked, his words deliberate and laced with a quiet intensity. She hesitated, the question catching her off guard. I don't," she admitted softly, her eyes locked on the dark, rippling water. Reed finally turned to face her, his gaze unwavering. "I wanted you to sit with it," he said simply. "I wanted you to feel the weight of your actions before any judgment was passed. Sometimes, the most important lessons come from facing the truth head-on." His words, though spoken in a measured tone, carried a burden of meaning that struck her deeply. Amber's heart ached with the realization that her actions had been driven not solely by frustration but by a deeply ingrained bias, a bias that she had long denied even to herself. I acted out of assumption," she confessed, her voice barely audible over the gentle rustle of the leaves. Reed's eyes softened for just a moment before hardening again. "That assumption, that bias, runs deep," he observed. "Every city I've lived in, every time I've been pulled over, it's a reminder that we all carry these hidden truths. You expected me to react like any other driver, nervous, defensive. But I remained calm. That, in your mind, must have been unacceptable." His quiet indictment was a mirror reflecting all the unspoken truths she had long tried to avoid. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze as the reality of his words sank in. "I thought I was in control," she whispered. "I believed I was enforcing the law, not violating it." Reed shook his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "Control isn't measured by how forcefully you impose your will on others," he replied. "It's measured by your willingness to confront your own inner demons, the biases that cloud your judgment and lead you to treat others unfairly." For several long minutes, the two of them sat together in silence, the only sound the gentle murmur of the river and the distant hum of the city. Finally, Reed stood up, his movement deliberate and full of quiet resolve. "You have a choice, Amber," he said as he began to walk slowly along the park's winding path. "You can either walk away from this incident and tell yourself that it was just a momentary lapse, a mistake that can be forgotten. Or you can use this experience to truly change, to examine the assumptions you've held onto for far too long." His voice, though soft, carried a weight that could not be ignored. At that moment, Amber realized that her future was now dependent on the decision she made. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was confronted with the possibility of redemption, a chance to rebuild her life on the foundation of honesty and introspection. "What will you do?" Reed asked quietly as they paused by a weathered bench overlooking the water. His eyes, steady and challenging, searched hers for the answer that could determine not only her future on the force but her future as a person. For hours afterward, Amber sat alone on that bench, replaying every moment of that long, haunting night in her mind. The raw emotions, the regret, and the stark truth of her actions mingled together, creating an internal dialogue that was both painful and necessary. It was in that quiet solitude that she began to truly understand the gravity of her mistake and the long road ahead to redeem herself. The days that followed were a blur of mandated training sessions and introspective solitude. At the de-escalation and bias training class, Amber found herself among a dozen other officers, ranging from fresh recruits to seasoned veterans. The classroom was a subdued space, the atmosphere thick with unspoken regrets and the collective need for change. The instructor, Veronica Miles, a retired detective whose life experience lent her an air of quiet authority, addressed the group with a directness that left no room for pretense. Veronica played a grainy body cam video of a similar traffic stop. In the footage, a white officer's frustration escalated over a minor infraction, culminating in the use of physical force that left the driver reeling. The room was silent as Veronica's measured voice broke through the tension. "Let's talk about assumptions," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room and finally resting on Amber. "What did the officer see when he pulled that driver over?" Amber's throat tightened as she recalled the memory of that night, the quick assumption, the misplaced aggression, and the undeniable truth that had followed. "He saw a threat," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Veronica nodded, her eyes kind yet unyielding. "And what did you see when you pulled over your driver?" she pressed softly. Amber's mind raced, searching for the words to describe the conflict inside her. I saw a challenge, a man who was unafraid to meet me with calm determination, she admitted. And in that moment, I assumed he was resisting me, that he was daring me to lose control. Veronica leaned forward, her tone gentle yet insistent. Where did that assumption come from? She asked, her voice softening as she continued, was it the way you were trained? Or perhaps the subtle messages that accumulate over the years, the idea that certain people are inherently more dangerous than others? Her words cut deep, forcing Amber to confront the painful reality of her own bias. For the first time, she allowed herself to face the truth, that her actions were not merely the product of a momentary lapse in judgment but the result of years of conditioning, a silent acceptance of an assumption that was never fully questioned. As Veronica's gaze held hers, Amber felt a small spark of hope ignite amidst the despair. It was a hope born not of forgiveness, but of the possibility of change. You have a choice, Veronica said firmly. You can continue down this path, or you can decide to examine these assumptions and let them go. The question isn't whether prejudice exists. It's whether you're willing to face it and do something about it. That evening, after an exhausting day of training and reflection, Amber walked back to the precinct with a heavy heart yet a glimmer of determination. The familiar sounds of the station, the ringing phones, the steady tapping of keyboards, and the murmurs of conversations reminded her of the life she had always known. But now, everything felt different. The halls that once echoed with routine activity now seemed to murmur secrets of unspoken truths and hidden biases. Even as she passed by her old desk, she couldn't help but notice the sideways glances and hushed tones among her colleagues. Then, unexpectedly, she caught sight of Chief Reed walking briskly toward his office. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, an unspoken acknowledgement of the ordeal they had both endured. Reed offered a simple nod before disappearing into the depths of the station. In that brief encounter, Amber understood that she had been granted something rare, a second chance. The road ahead was uncertain and fraught with the weight of her past mistakes, but she now had the opportunity to forge a new path, one built on accountability, reflection, and a willingness to change. Over the next several weeks, Amber dedicated herself to the internal training, determined to understand the roots of her actions and learn how to truly de-escalate tense situations. Each training session, each conversation with her colleagues, and every silent moment of introspection chipped away at the armor she had built around herself. The process was neither swift nor painless, but gradually, she began to see a different way forward, one where authority was tempered by empathy, and power was balanced by self-awareness. 2 months later, the day finally came when Amber returned to duty. As she stepped back into the precinct, the familiar hum of everyday operations greeted her, yet there was a palpable difference in the air. Her colleagues no longer regarded her with overt pity or judgment. Instead, there was a cautious respect, an unspoken acknowledgement that she had confronted her inner darkness and emerged with a new understanding. Before she could settle into her old routine, Chief Reed intercepted her with a quiet, yet sincere greeting, "Welcome back, Officer Ford." His words, simple as they were, carried a depth of understanding that resonated with every fiber of her being. Amber offered a tentative smile and a soft thank you, fully aware that this was just the beginning of a long journey of redemption. As she sat down at her desk, she couldn't help but reflect on everything that had transpired, the choices she had made, the consequences that had followed, and the chance she now had to rebuild not only her career but also her sense of self. The lessons of that fateful night, the introspection during those long, solitary hours, and the hard truths revealed during training were all now woven into the fabric of her being. In a quiet moment before the day's routine began, she opened the personal journal she had started on the day of the incident. The pages, filled with raw, unfiltered thoughts, bore witness to her struggle with shame, regret, and ultimately, the burgeoning hope for change. Each line, each painful admission of bias and misdirected authority, was a step toward acknowledging the truth and committing to a better path. As the day wore on, Officer Ford realized that the incident had transformed more than just her professional standing, it had altered her very perception of herself. No longer could she hide behind the veneer of unquestioned authority now, every interaction, every decision, carried the weight of accountability and the potential for growth. With each challenge that arose, she reminded herself of Chief Reed's words, of the importance of facing one's inner demons and using that confrontation as a catalyst for real change. And so, the story of that fateful night became not merely a tale of a single mistake, but a powerful lesson on the nature of bias and the transformative power of self-reflection. It was a reminder that prejudice isn't always overt or loud. Sometimes, it is quiet, insidious, and hidden in the assumptions we make about others. As Officer Ford continued on her journey, she knew that the true test was not how she would regain her lost authority but how she would rebuild her integrity and redefine what it meant to serve with compassion and fairness. If you were given the chance to confront your deepest assumptions and transform a single moment of regret into a lifetime of change, what steps would you take and how far are you willing to go to truly redefine what it means to lead with heart and fairness?